33 days, 33 episodes, no off switch. From the goals and the glory to the politics and the problems of the World Cup. If you want soccer analysis from a podcast that's been over-analysing the game for more than 20 years, then this is it. Join me, Max Rushton, and our expert team of soccer journalists every day of the tournament. Can England end 60 years of hurt, or will this be another year of falling just short? Probably. World Cup Daily. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or watch full episodes on YouTube.
This episode is brought to you by Fox One. Watch all 104 matches of the FIFA World Cup live in 4K for just $19.99 a month with 3 days free. Build your own multi-view, choose up to 3 streams, and follow player spotlights. Stay on top of every moment with live stats, highlights, and instant replays. The FIFA World Cup, streaming live on Fox One. Offers are subject to change. See fox.com for complete terms and conditions.
On the evening of the 11th of September, 1683, in the hills outside Vienna, the Polish king Jan Sobieski launched what remains the largest cavalry charge in history. Within the hour, his hussars had smashed the morale of their Ottoman opponents and driven them from the field. The siege of Vienna was lifted. The tide of Ottoman imperialism was turned back. And in that moment, it's often said, the balance of power between Christendom and Islam changed forever. So when exactly 20 years ago, Osama bin Laden chose the same date, the 11th of September, to launch his attacks on New York and Washington, D.C., he did so very deliberately. This was his attempt to reverse what Jan Sobieski had done outside Vienna, and to pull off a similarly spectacular, world-changing victory that would be remembered for centuries to come. But will it? Tom Holland, will 9/11 be remembered as long as the Siege of Vienna?
That's a very good question. I suspect it will, because it was filmed.
Yeah.
And I think that anything that's filmed is destined to last. And that was a key aspect of 9/11, was that it was designed to have an incredible visual impact.
Yeah. Planned as a spectacle, wasn't it?
It's planned as a spectacle.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so we're doing this obviously because it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which, when it happened, felt like the most seismic of global events.
Yes.
Do you feel it's kind of maintained that status 20 years on?
That's a really interesting question, because I think it's a very good example of how the meaning of historical events changes over time, isn't it? I think it felt like, in my lifetime, I would say there are 2 global events that felt absolutely earth-shattering, and one was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 9/11 was the other one. But of course 9/11 was more visceral because, as you say, it was planned as a spectacle, and it felt like something from, it felt unimaginable, but it felt at the same time like something you'd seen at the cinema. And the meaning of it now, 20 years on, particularly in the aftermath of the retreat from Afghanistan, feels different, doesn't it? Because we now know what happened next. So we know that it led to 2 wars, it led indirectly anyway to 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, both of which involved hundreds of thousands of casualties and, didn't end well for the West. So it will always, I think it will always be remembered. But a bit like, this is such a hackneyed, I feel ashamed of myself for even making it, but it does feel a bit like the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, as in 1914, the trigger for the First World War, because it did trigger wars that unfolded as the protagonists did not expect. But I guess the difference is that 9/11 was also loaded with all kinds of cultural, kind of intellectual, ideological meanings, wasn't it? About the clash of civilizations and about, Islam and the West and modernity against supposed medievalism and so on, which is kind of your territory, really.
Yes. I guess that was pretty much how I certainly saw it. It was almost impossible not to see it through the prism of those East-West, Islam, all that kind of stuff. But I think now that my take on it would be that it was really about globalization.
Right.
I think. And I think that, oddly, in that sense, bin Laden and George Bush are kind of on the same side, almost. It sounds a kind of heretical thing to say,
Because they're universalizers, do you think?
Both of them are universalizers. So if we go back to the Islam-Christianity thing, the thing about Islam and Christianity is that they're both universalist missionary faiths. They both feel that they have a kind of a right, a duty to spread their understanding of the world for the good of humanity as far as they possibly can. And bin Laden and Bush were both the heirs of those assumptions. But I think also they're both expressive of that very distinctive moment in the 90s and the early noughties that we talked about before on our 90s episode, where globalization is seen as a positive.
Yes.
But lots of people hate it. And actually, both Bush and bin Laden come a cropper because they overestimate people's readiness to embrace a kind of globalized world, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday and reading up on the sort of 1990s context. So the 9/11 is obviously much closer to the fall of the Berlin Wall than it is to us now. I mean, it's 10 years or so from the fall of the Berlin Wall, 12 years, and it's 20 years away from us. And I think it kind of, one way that I would make sense of it is in the back, after all the stuff, Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, his argument that Western liberal, I mean, that's the classic universalizing argument. The Western liberal, that history is this sort of Hegelian struggle of ideologies. And the last one, the last man standing, is liberal democracy, and that is going to, that is going to conquer. But there are also books like in 1990, I mean, so early actually, 1992, a guy called Benjamin Barber wrote an article in The Atlantic called Jihad versus McWorld. Became a book a year later, very successful at the time, saying, there were two forces that will decide the course of human affairs. One is globalization, and the other is what he called tribalism. So he basically...
But he's equating tribalism with jihad. Yeah,
but he's using jihad he's using it loosely, actually. He doesn't just mean Islamic fundamentalism. He means...
I think he gets that spectacularally wrong. Because I think the whole point about bin Laden is that he, like Bush, is an internationalist.
Yeah.
And that's and this is a sense that's been very much sharpened by what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment. Because the point about the Taliban, where bin Laden, took refuge, is that the Taliban regarded bin Laden with considerable suspicion.
Yes.
When he took refuge there, I mean, they viewed him as a kind of a problem that had been left in Afghanistan by the warlords that bin Laden had been fighting with and who the Taliban had overthrown. And specifically, they were suspicious of bin Laden. They were suspicious of the fact that he appeared on TV, Taliban banned TV.
Right.
They were suspicious of the kind of the rootless cosmopolitanism.
Well, the modernity of al-Qaeda, right?
Of all the various people from the various Arab countries that had come to join bin Laden. They were suspicious of this. Just as conversely, bin Laden regarded the Taliban with a kind of measure of contempt, a kind of, a globalist contempt for bumpkins, because they weren't interested in
Tom, let me just,
global jihad.
Our producer is saying we should remind people who Osama bin Laden was.
Yes, we should.
That seems an extraordinary thing to say, because, but of course, she's quite right. Younger listeners, we assume, of course, that everyone's as steeped in it as we are, but, it is 20 years ago. So give us a very quick sort of bio of Osama bin Laden, very broad brush.
So, I think actually we should pull the camera out even further, and we should try and just look at just explain what built up to 9/11 and then the aftermath for people who may not be particularly familiar with it. So, the context, I think, is provided by the way in which the West's universalism over the past 2 centuries has come to put in the shade Islam's claim to universalism, and in the Muslim world there have been various responses to this. Accommodation, ranging from to outright opposition.
Yeah.
In the 90s, when it looked, as you said, the end of history, the triumph of the West, liberal democracies prevailed everywhere. This sharpens and hardens a feeling among Islamic radicals that this Western triumphalism has to be opposed. The person who becomes synonymous with this is a Saudi, Osama bin Laden, skin of a very, very kind of prosperous Saudi industrialist family, making concrete and all kinds of things like that. He's a kind, he's I think the 19th son or something like that, and he goes off as romantic young men have always done, to go and fight for noble causes. And his cause is fighting the Soviets and then in Afghanistan. The Soviets leave. Bin Laden comes to the conclusion that America, the great Satan, and Satan in Islam is a tempter. It's not quite the embodiment of evil that he is in the Western imagination. He's the tempter. So America is the great Satan. Bin Laden comes to think that rather than fight local wars, as the Taliban have been doing in Afghanistan, what is needed is to join Muslims across the world in a common battle against their common enemy. Because Bin Laden comes to see that all these kind of local battles, the fact that there is infidel influence in Afghanistan, the fact that after the first Iraq War, there are American troops in Arabia, and Muhammad had specifically said that there should be only one faith only one deed, only one religion in Arabia, that this is an outrage, that across the entire Muslim world, the West is kind of intruding, and particularly America. And therefore, they need to take the fight to the Americans. And so he forms this group, al-Qaeda, which basically means the foundation, the base, to launch the fight back. And he comes to the conclusion that the best way to do this is to attack America in its homeland. And so he recruits various young men to embark on a martyrdom operation. They will go to America, they will learn to fly, and on 9/11, or the 11th of September, as we in Britain call it, they fly. The plan is that they will fly 4 planes into various icons of American financial, military, and governmental power. So the Twin Towers in New York, which comes off, the Pentagon, which comes off, and either the Capitol or the White House. This doesn't come off because the people on the hijacked planes realize what's happening, force the controls, and crash the plane.
I mean, unbelievably moving story, even now, 20 years on. I when you read it, you kind of feel your kind of eyeballs prickling at them
and the
storming
messages that are coming down and everything. Yeah, it's powerful stuff. And all of this, of course, is being played out, as you say, on television. This is the first age where kind of messages can bounce around the world. The internet is cranking up. And so it apart from anything else, it's an incredible spectacle.
Yeah, it is.
And it's devastating for Americans in particular, both for that reason, but also because they've been attacked on American soil. Yeah. And America come to see itself as being basically impregnable within its own homeland. And so the question then becomes, well, what are they going to do? And President Bush, who's been flying all around America and various bases on 9/11 itself, decides that they're not going to treat this as a criminal operation. They're not going to treat it as a police matter. They're going to treat it as something altogether more existential. America is at war, and it is at war with terror.
Well, let's come to that. Let's come to the reaction a little bit later, but let's unpack a couple of things there. So Osama bin Laden, it's often said that al-Qaeda and bin Laden and so on, they were mad, irrational and so on. But actually, he published numerous statements explaining quite sort of specifically his objections and his goals. And the two things that come up again and again are obviously American support for Israel. But one of them is that thing that you mentioned about American troops in Saudi Arabia. And that's obviously a consequence of the Gulf War. And a little known fact is that bin Laden had offered his mujahideen to the Saudi king to protect them against Saddam Hussein, when everybody thought that Saddam was going to go on from Kuwait and attack Saudi Arabia. And the king of Saudi Arabia said, no, thank you. I can live without your 50 ragtag men. I'd rather have the US military. So the US and bin Laden is absolutely incensed by this.
Yeah.
And my question to you, Tom, is how much do you think that's shared? I mean, how much is that personal pique, in a way, that his homeland has got American troops in it and he has this animus against America? And how much is that more widely shared, a sort of sense of outrage that American troops in particular, the embodiment of Western modernity, are in the holy, are guarding the holy places, as it were?
I think it's a kind of there's the embers are definitely hot, and they can be blown on, And that's essentially what bin Laden sets himself to do. But I think that bin Laden is expressive of a whole trend within Islamic militancy, which sees a need to respond to Westernization, let's call it that, Westernization, by looking back to the example of the Prophet and his companions, so the Salafists. And this Salafist tradition then fuses with a jihadi tradition. And the jihadi tradition is the idea that you best serve God by basically by fighting to maintain the dignity, indeed the power of his dispensation. So Salafi jihadism is a trend that has, it's a kind of movement. It's a way of seeing the world that has been kind of bubbling away below the surface. And the thing is that the West is it's not looking at this. Its eye has been fixed on the Cold War for so long, and even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it can't take this stuff seriously, because people getting cross about American troops being present in Arabia because the Prophet had said that no Christians or Jews should be allowed into Arabia seems mad to Americans. Likewise, bin Laden is he's terribly upset about the end of the caliphate. So after 9/11, he issues a statement and he says what America is tasting now is something insignificant compared to what we, i.e. Muslims, have tasted for scores of years. Our nation has been tasting this humiliation and degradation for more than 80 years. And he's talking there about the ending of the caliphate, which with the end of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is not the kind of stuff that in Langley anyone in CIA is taking seriously at all. Or in MI5 or in the French security services or anything like that.
But Tom, there is a sense in America, though, that there has been a growing sense, I think, since the Iranian Revolution and America's humiliation in the hostage crisis at the end of the 1970s into 1980, that there was a new enemy, as it were, awakening. So this is a very strange thing to talk about in a podcast about 9/11. But we watched The Naked Gun the other day, the Leslie Nielsen film, and the beginning of that is a scene in which the hero, Lieutenant Frank Drebin, he bursts in, and all America's enemies are gathered in a room. Now Gorbachev is there, but he's not the chairman. The chair of the meeting is the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the other people around the room are Yasser Arafat. I mean, Idi Amin is there, bizarrely. So Yasser Arafat is there.
Saddam Hussein is there?
I'm not sure if Saddam Hussein is there. Colonel Gaddafi is there. I think because when it was made, late 80s, Gaddafi was loomed larger in the Western consciousness as a hate figure than Saddam Hussein did, actually, because, of course, Libya had been involved in sponsoring terrorism and so on. So, and it happens in the Middle East as well. I think it happens the scene is set in Morocco or somewhere, or Beirut. Sorry, it's in Beirut.
Beirut, isn't it? Yeah.
It is in Beirut. So there's already a sense there that the Cold War is being, it's such a strange thing to allude to, but the Cold War is being shuffled off stage because Gorbachev says at one point, I have the Americans believing I'm a nice guy. Whereas the others are clearly out and out villains. And there's a sort of, I think there was a growing sense in the 1990s, you see this in so many Hollywood films, that the new threat was going to come from the Middle East and from Islamic fundamentalism, don't you think? So all that sort of Samuel Huntington stuff, the clash of civilizations, for example.
But not quite in the way that the Salafi jihadists embody it. Because the thing, Gaddafi is, his relationship to Islam is very ambivalent.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
There's this kind of Ba'athist tradition, which is basically kind of, it's Ba'athism is which is the ideology of Saddam Hussein and of the Assads in Syria.
Well, that's about modernization, isn't it? Yeah.
That's founded by a Christian. It's founded by a Christian. So that's a kind of sinister, fascist. Basically, it owes more to fascism than it does to Islam. Ayatollah Khomeini, he's a Shiite.
Yes.
And so Shiism, is not missionary in the way that Sunniism is. So we just explain, that these are kind of the two great traditions within Islam. what bin Laden brings to the imagination, and I think you're absolutely right to frame it in terms of Hollywood, because this is an influence on how the Americans understand 9/11, but it's also, it's an influence on how bin Laden comes to imagine attacking the Trade Center, because in the training camps, most of the people who are going there, they're kind of deracinated. They're people from often very westernized. They're kind of younger sons of wealthy families, but like bin Laden himself. They're often English speaking. These are very, very kind of internationalist camps. And in the evenings, after they've done their training and their indoctrination and everything, they will sit down and they'll watch Hollywood films. They're kind of big fans of Schwarzenegger and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And so, what 9/11 does is to cast bin Laden actually as a kind of Bond villain.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Because, in his cave network, his base, I remember all those illustrations in the newspapers claiming that this was this incredibly sophisticated bunker.
The Ayatollah or Gaddafi or Idi Amin or I suppose Kim Jong-un in, what was it, the puppet one?
Team America.
Team America. I mean, these are all kind of baddies who are leaders of countries. Yeah. Bin Laden is stateless. Bin Laden has had his Saudi passport taken away from him. And that's what makes him such a kind of ideal figure to play the role of a Bond villain. Yes. And you're right about that. So when after 9/11, the Americans and NATO attack Afghanistan and they move into the Tora Bora mountains, and bin Laden and al-Qaeda are hiding out in caves. And I remember there was a kind of picture in the Sunday Times of this cave complex.
Yeah.
They didn't actually say it had swimming pools, but I mean, they might as well have done. It was entirely fabricated from someone who'd been watching too many James Bond films. It's
Blofeld space, basically,
yes,
isn't it?
Absolutely. And there was all this kind of talk about how they were fighting their way through cave complexes and things. Absolute rubbish. There were no cave complexes. There was none of it. It was just a load of caves. But that kind of internationalism, that both sides saw the other as the embodiment of a kind of sinister and terrifying conspiracy to take over the world and destroy everything that was good. So bin Laden is talking about good and evil. He's talking about God and Satan. And Bush, likewise, in the aftermath of 9/11, is talking about good and evil.
Axis of evil. Yes, exactly. And I think you're absolutely right about the internationalism of the sort of al-Qaeda recruits. I mean, Mohammed Atta, for example, he was the chief hijacker. He was the oldest. Hamburg. I think he'd studied urban planning.
Egyptian from Hamburg.
Exactly. He'd studied urban planning in Hamburg. This extraordinary story, I'm not sure how true this is, that his parents or his father had overheard two Germans speaking on holiday in Egypt and had talked to them, and they turned out to be running a sort of exchange scheme. And he said, my son's really interested in urban planning. Can he come to... And he goes off to Germany. And it's that classic thing which you also see with Sayyid Qutb, who's one of the sort of, arguably the sort of founding father of modern Islamic militancy, isn't he? That of the sort of the guy who's been uprooted, he's gone to the sort of modern Western country and he's lonely, miserable. People aren't, friendly to him. People are mean to him. And he feels left out, and that resentment grows and grows and builds and builds. And you see that pattern, don't you, again and again, in the profiles of some of these people involved in the story.
Well, I think it's interesting. So Atta is Egyptian. Zahiri, who is bin Laden's number two, I think he's still currently
he's still out there.
al-Qaeda, isn't he? Somewhere, who knows where he is. I mean, he's Egyptian. He was a surgeon. Got involved in the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. Sadat, of course, having signed the peace concord with Israel, so that was his crime. And you mentioned Sayyid Qutb, who was a kind of stoop-shouldered, balding, very shy Egyptian who goes in the aftermath of the Second World War to America, to New York, to Washington, and then to this town in Colorado.
That's
which
right.
was
Yeah.
kind of founded by temperance. So it's very, very straight-laced. But he regarded it as absolutely Sodom and Gomorrah, and was kind of obsessed by the lewdness of American women and all kinds of things. And
he wrote lots of weird
it.
stuff about
Yes.
buttocks and stuff. That clearly there's a lot going on in his subconscious.
Yeah, and so I think that with Egypt, so this is all coming off the backdrop of this is why I want to do Napoleon in Egypt, because of course Egypt is the first target really for the modern West. Napoleon conquers it, then the British inherit it, and I think that for Egyptians, Cairo, the great cultural center of Islam in its golden ages, to go from the chaos of Cairo, the poverty of Cairo, to American cities in the 50s, or to Hamburg in the 90s to study town planning, you feel a sense of kind of humiliation, I think. And that's evident in Qutb, and I think it's evident in Atta. And I think also, I don't want to kind of do cod psychology, but there is a kind of sexual dimension to it as well, because both Qutb and Atta are obsessed by the easy availability of sex in Western cities. And Muhammad Atta in his will leaves this kind of weird prescriptions that no pregnant women will attend his funeral procession and no women will be allowed to visit his grave or anything like that.
Well, so Atta had stayed in Hamburg before he goes to America to carry out the deed. He's been staying with a family who had a daughter who was unmarried but had a baby. And they kicked him out, I think, eventually, because he treated her with such contempt. And this girl and her baby, this young woman and her baby, played a massive part in his imagination as sort of symbols of Western decadence. Yeah. And I don't think you have to go too deep into the world of quad psychology to see that there is something kind of weird going on in his mind there. And so
Qutb writes these, these texts that really kind of, are the match that lights the kind of blaze that Bin Laden will then kind of really blow up. That's a terrible metaphor, but in some sense, and he is basically saying we have to turn our backs on this, and we have to look back to the example of the Prophet. And Islam is only Islam that can save not just Muslims but the whole of humanity. So it is, the stakes could not be higher. And in a way, in a sense, Bush is the same, and that's what makes it's not 9/11 itself that is particularly important, shocking though it is, overwhelmingly. It's the reactions to it.
Okay, well, that's a perfect point to take a break, and then we'll come back and we should talk about George W. Bush and the reaction to 9/11. See you in a minute.
Hello. Excuse the brief interruption. We'll soon have you back in the warm embrace of Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. But first, we wanted to tell you about our new podcast, Tommy's and Jerry's, which explores the relationship between Britain and Germany through history to the present. It features me, Oliver Moody, a Briton based in Berlin, and Katja Heuer, a German historian, mostly enjoying life in England. Here's a brief taster.
Break out the beach towels and bag the best spot. Welcome to Tommy's and Jerry's, a new podcast in which we plan to put the Realpolitik and the Eröffnungsdiskussionsorgien into the world of podcasting. Each week we'll discuss the past and present of Anglo-German relations.
What makes us different, and what makes us sometimes painfully similar. There's a very famous picture of Thatcher driving along in a Challenger tank with a British flag flying, and she's got her goggles on and her scarf. She looks like the absolute warrior queen, almost like a Britannia-style nationalistic figure. But when you look at the zoomed-out version of that photo, it was actually taken on a British military base in West Germany. And right next to her, there's Cole trundling along on his own Leopard 2 German battle tank with a German flag. And it was clearly some effort to try and give them like a fun day out together. And all that it's remembered for is just as this symbol of British nationalism.
Yeah, and that's probably exactly how she would have liked it as well.
Things have got so bad that there's this paper that turned up showing that Cole had made a formal request not to talk to Thatcher anymore and to talk to the Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, instead. And Thatcher had just scribbled on it in massive capital letter handwriting, "No!"
because they made no effort to hide that either. Thatcher in particular was kind of openly hostile. You see that on all of the photographs. I don't think they ever had as bad a relationship as people made it out to be honest, Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel. You don't see Boris sort of slapping Angie on the back, but you do get the sense from the last visit that there was a genuine effort.
I'm not so sure. I've been told in Berlin that actually it's terrible. It's really, really bad. And she can't stand him.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to Tommy's and Jerry's.
Search for Tommy's and Jerry's wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Gary Lineker from Goalhangers. The rest is football. This episode is brought to you by Wise. It's only when you start moving money between currencies that you really think about the exchange rate, the fee, and what might be hidden away in the small print. Whether you're living abroad, paying someone overseas, or just trying to manage your money across borders, you want a fair exchange rate, an easy transfer, and no surprises along the way. Wise keeps things simple. Wise is a smart way to move the currencies you need around the globe. It works in more than 160 countries and with over 40 currencies. Most transfers arrive instantly. Wise uses the mid-market exchange rate, like the one you see on Google, with no markups or hidden fees. So when money needs to move, you can see the rate, know the fee, and get on with it. Join millions saving billions on hidden fees by downloading the Wise app today. Be smart, get wise. T's and C's apply.
This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. It's easy to ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile.
Sign up online at mintmobile.com/history and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
Are you looking for support in your weight management journey? Zepbound tirzepatide may be able to help. Zepbound is a prescription medicine used with a reduced calorie diet and increased physical activity to help adults with obesity or some adults with overweight who also have weight-related medical problems to lose excess body weight and keep the weight off. Zepbound is approved as a 2.5, 5, 7.5, 10, 12.5, or 15 milligram injection. Zepbound contains tirzepatide and should not be used with other tirzepatide-containing products or any GLP-1 receptor agonist medicines. It is not known if Zepbound is safe and effective for use in children. Don't share needles or pens or reuse needles. Don't take if allergic to it, or if you or someone in your family had medullary thyroid cancer, or if you've had multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome type 2. Tell your doctor if you get a lump or swelling in your neck. Stop Zepbound and call your doctor if you have severe stomach pain or a serious allergic reaction. Severe side effects may include inflamed pancreas or gallbladder problems. Tell your doctor if you experience vision changes before scheduled procedures with anesthesia, if you're nursing, pregnant, plan to be, or taking birth control pills. Taking Zepbound with a sulfonylurea or insulin may cause low blood sugar. Side effects include nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting, which can cause dehydration and worsen kidney problems. Talk to your doctor. Call 1-800-545-5979 or visit zepbound.lilly.com.
Welcome back to The Rest is History. We're talking about 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center and on Washington, D.C. that happened exactly 20 years ago. Tom, there was a documentary on the BBC a couple of nights ago, absolutely brilliant documentary about George W. Bush and sort of taking you through minute by minute his reaction as the day unfolded. You saw it, didn't you?
I did. The guy who made it, Adam Wishart.
A friend of yours.
Old friend.
Everybody's a friend of Tom Holland.
A fantastic film.
Yeah.
And how charming they all seemed.
Well, this is the extraordinary thing. These people who, I mean, if you move as we do in kind of literary media sort of circles in Britain, I mean, all these people are reviled, you know, to a degree that, I mean, this sounds like an absurd thing to say, but I've heard people slagging off George W. Bush far more often than I've heard them slagging off Osama bin Laden. But he came across as, in that documentary, as remarkably human.
But the reason for that is that we're judging him by our standards.
Yeah, of course.
And what I would say about Bush is that what he did was far worse than anything that Trump did.
Right.
Or Biden. I think he trashed the American brand and the Western brand.
Okay, well, let's come back to that in a sec. I think Bin
Laden trashed the Islamic brand. So one of the things that I think has come out of 9/11 is that the global reputation of both Islam and the West has been seriously damaged.
Well, Islam and also specifically America, Tom. I think
Britain as well.
There were, I don't know Britain. There were, there's all this amazing footage after 9/11 of Vladimir Putin lighting candles, people around the world uniting in support, playing the American national anthem, waving American flags in the days after the event. Not everywhere, of course. I mean, not in Ramallah, but worldwide, particularly, and obviously, especially in Europe. And in a way, that seems odd now because the reaction against America was so quick after the invasion of Iraq. 2 years later, wasn't it? But the thing is, watching that documentary, so George Bush had only been in office since January, and he'd come into office as, the documentary, he says this specifically, I came in as a domestic president, which I remember at the time because I was in America during that election campaign, and he said again and again, the US is no longer going to be the world's policeman. So he wanted, he was preaching an antidote to what he saw as Clinton's interventionism in Somalia and his drone and his airstrikes and these kinds of things. Bush said, we're not going to do that anymore. And then the documentary captures very well the fact that in just a few hours, Bush's whole sense of himself and his role in history changes. There's that famous footage. He's reading books, isn't he, with a kind of primary school class.
About a goat, I think.
They're doing spelling, and the footage is amazing.
Yeah.
They go in on his eyes, and you see the flicker in his eyes when he's told. He doesn't rush off because he doesn't want to scare the children, but within hours, his sense of who he is and what he is for has changed. And I actually thought what that documentary captured, and this is why the assassination of Franz Ferdinand seems to me a reasonable parallel, is the extent to which he's the prisoner of events as well as their master. So he says, he knew what the American people expected. And there's a moment at the end of the documentary when he's talking to firefighters amid the wreckage of the World Trade Center. And what people forget is that he says this himself, is he starts off talking about praying and sort of sorrow and coming together and stuff. And he says in the documentary, I could see they didn't want to hear that. I was an experienced politician. I could read the crowd. What they wanted to hear was, we're going to go and, kick their ass, which is basically what he says at the end. And what he did. And what he did, he changes his tone. But the question, I suppose, is, would any American president have behaved differently? At the end of this period of when they thought their top nation of great, buoyant American exceptionalism, they have this, the gap between them and the rest of the world militarily is probably greater in 2001 than ever before or since, because China has yet to fully rearm as it has now. Could anybody have resisted that, Tom? They were always going to go into Afghanistan, weren't they?
I think going into Afghanistan was inevitable. I think I don't see any way in which I agree. No American president could not have done that. I think the wrong turn was what happened after Afghanistan, which essentially is Iraq.
Yeah.
And there are two kind of two takes on Iraq as to why the Americans go into Iraq. One is the kind of bleakly cynical one that it's all about oil or Israel or vengeance for Saddam Hussein being horrid to George Bush's dad or whatever.
Yeah.
And the other is that it was a necessary step in the war on terror, and that it was a welcome chance to overthrow a kind of horrible tyrant in the form of Saddam Hussein. And of course, it could be both, and probably was both, all kinds of different interests kind of mixing and merging. And we know, we talked about this in the context of the British Empire, that kind of blend of self-interest and messianism is absolutely, that's what propels empires. But I think that the reason that Bush was so calamitous was that I think that he, and you talk about this dawning sense on his face that he is someone who's been put at a pivotal moment in history, and his decisions are going to count. I think he feels that he's been put there by God, He is a deeply, deeply believing Christian. And I think that he believes, when he talks about good and evil, that the war on terror, it could have been a police operation, but it isn't. And, the operations that it's kind of Operation Enduring Freedom. The original name for the war on terror was going to be Operation Infinite Justice. This is a crusade. He used the word crusade and then got kind of told off by his advisors because this wasn't advisable. But it was a crusade in exactly the same way as bin Laden, likewise, sees himself as embroiled in a fight for good and evil. And the thing that complicates it with Bush, and of course with Blair as well, is that they never frame it in overtly Christian terms, even though everyone knows that this is where they're coming from. Instead, what they do, and again, I think this is entirely, I don't think they're lying about this, but Bush repeatedly says about bin Laden and al-Qaeda that they're corrupting Islam, that they don't really understand Islam, that they haven't got it right, and that basically Islam is entirely compatible with Western liberal democracy. Blair said that. I mean, every Western leader said that in the aftermath of 9/11 for very understandable reasons, because they didn't want to provoke kind of anti-Muslim feeling within the West itself, or indeed beyond. But I think the problem with that was that it was a kind of cultural arrogance, because it suggested everything that bin Laden was terrified about. It was suggesting precisely that, yes, Islam, this ancient, sophisticated civilization, can absolutely just be folded into the maw of, Hamburg town planning or sex clubs or whatever. That it's just another kind of interesting local detail, and that essentially the morals and the values of humanity are equivalent to those of Westerners at the beginning of the 21st century.
Well, that's all that sort of stuff about fighting for Enlightenment values, isn't it?
Absolutely,
that we should export Enlightenment values, and that Islam can somehow can easily be folded into it, as you say.
But that's not really. But Bush isn't talking about Enlightenment values. He's talking about rights. He's talking about freedoms. He's saying, why do they hate us? They hate us for our freedom.
Yeah.
But these are very, very culturally specific American perspectives.
See, my take on Bush would be slightly different in that I think straight away Bush transforms himself into an unashamed American nationalist. And, I think of things like, the Patriot Act, which is the act that enshrines surveillance, the Department of Homeland Security. I always found that such a jarring name, because I always thought when people talk about the homeland, I mean, it's something that we in Britain would never do. We would. It's impossible to, isn't it? Well, at least maybe they've got one, God Almighty. But that sort of rhetoric, and I think to me one of his great mistakes, apart from Iraq, obviously, was in speaking purely to a domestic American audience, and I can completely understand why he did that.
I don't think he was, though, because because he's endlessly sending messages. Actually, when you look at them, how many messages how often he talks about Islam, how often he addresses the Muslim world. There's a lot of it. And it's all kind of character. He says, when it comes to the common rights and needs of men and women, there is no clash of civilizations. Essentially, he's saying that his understanding of what the rights and needs of men and women are equivalent to all of humanity's. And he's absolutely framing his, and I think that he does have this kind of universalist mission, as Blair did as well. And it was really, really kind of vital part of what they were about. It's why they're waging a war on terror. But I think at the same time, there is incredibly chauvinist nationalist figures in his administration. And, Bush is obviously a very smart, astute politician, but I don't think he's as smart
as Dick Cheney.
Say as Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld. Vice President Donald Rumsfeld, the defense, what do they have? Secretary of State for Defense? What do they call it?
Secretary of Defense. Yeah. And immense Washington veterans. I mean, they've been around since the Nixon administration.
They are all about, America first.
Yes.
And that kind of that sense of a moral mission that Bush and Blair had. And that's why, the Jeremy Paxman question to Blair, did he pray together, was such a, it was kind of probing this absolutely neuralgic, because he had no doubt that they were praying together. But the problem was that the moment they cast it as a war on terror and felt that therefore this legitimated basically kind of, invading and overthrowing anybody that they wanted to, they were brought up against the fact that actually lots of people didn't want the kind of freedom
Yeah.
that they were bringing, didn't want the kind of understanding of what was right and proper that Bush and Blair believed in. And therefore we're going to fight back. And the moment they started fighting back, every imperial force has a choice. Do you cut and run, or do you fight?
Yeah,
and the Americans chose to fight. And so therefore, inevitably, the corollary of that is that you start killing people. And in due course, you start torturing people. And, the kind of the trashing of the rule of law, the rule of international law, which is a completely Western structure. I mean, bin Laden's right about that. Al-Zarqawi, this kind of terrifying murderous figure known as the Sheikh of Slaughterers in Iraq, who, blows up weddings, slits windpipes. I mean, a terrifying figure. He's absolutely committed to the idea that international law is a Western scam. It's a Christian scam. And therefore, al-Zarqawi blows up the United Nations in Baghdad for that reason.
But this is why things like Guantanamo, the camp at Guantanamo, but also
so lethal.
Those horrendous pictures, Lindy, England, that was the woman's name, wasn't it? And the prison that was Iraq, wasn't it?
Yes.
They are so damaging to the American brand, and because if you're claiming to, if you frame it in ideological, cultural terms as a war on terror, in other words, what you're offering is kind of virtue, peace, and so on. And if you just trash that with your own activities, then it's hardly surprising that you're going to inflame people against you. But actually, Tom, before you go back on, you re-embark on your fascinating lecture. I wanted to say moral mission. That sense of moral mission, I think a lot of that comes from the Cold War. So it is quite close to the Cold War in time, this. It's only 10 years since 12 years anyway, since the end of the Cold War. And those people that you mentioned, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, they'd been Cold War hawks. And so many of the neoconservative intellectuals around them, and even people who hadn't previously been neoconservatives, so people like Christopher Hitchens, they're kind of steeped in that idea of Cold War, good versus evil. We are on the side of progress, modernity, reason. They're on the side of barbarism. And I think that plays a huge part. That this is almost the last generation, I think, who, it's the sort of last, they're a sort of pre-postmodernist generation. They absolutely believe in good versus evil, right versus wrong. And, it's not about competing narratives. It's about genuine, absolute moral truths.
Absolutely. But it ends up with figures in Baghdad jails, being electroded and being carried around, being leashed like dogs. And it leads to the West trampling on the law, the frameworks of international law, the understanding of human rights that supposedly they're going to war to defend. And the mirror image of that is what bin Laden is doing to the reputation of Islam. Because, for lots of people who are not Muslim, thanks to bin Laden and thanks to the kind of the cycle of terrorism that he helped to inspire, Islam is now, synonymous with jihad, which is synonymous with bombs on tube trains. And,
yes,
and so I think that and that's why we began. I said, I think it's actually about globalization. I think it's about these two great globalizing forces, Islam and Christendom, the West, whatever you want to call it. They've both been fighting a proxy war over the past 20 years. They've both completely trashed their brands. And of course, we emerge, the Americans are leaving Afghanistan. It's not even as though, the Taliban or indeed ISIS, they're now left to fight each other. So it's kind of squalid fight over the spoils there. So it's not like they've won any great victory either. And lurking on the eastern borders is China, which it does not have a kind of universalizing mission or vision.
And it's purely nationalist vision.
Yeah, sure. And all the smoke, it's kind of civilizational, perhaps you might say, but all the smoke that's lifted from 9/11, is fading away. And what we see is a world where America, in pursuit of a kind of universalizing mission, has trashed its brand, massively overloaded its credit card, and China has gone through leaps and bounds. So actually, bin Laden wanted to bleed America to death. That was his ambition. He wanted to provoke America to do exactly what it did. But it's not Islam that's benefited from it. It's China.
No. But Tom, do you think then that in the grand sweep of history, in the very grand scheme of things, do you think 9/11 really matters? I mean, China was going to rise anyway. American power was arguably at its peak in the 1990s and bound to then decline. Islam, the tension between Islam and the West was already there. Do you think that is it a turning point? Does it change history in a really grand sort of big picture way? Do you think?
I think that so Jason Burke, observer, journalist,
very good writer,
fabulous book,
Taliban,
the 9/11 wars. I think that's as good a phrase for them as any. I mean, I think if you lived through the 9/11 wars, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, I mean, 9/11 really mattered.
Yeah.
I it rubbed up close against me personally on a couple of occasions. So when my younger daughter was, she must have been only about 6 months or something, maybe a bit older. Maybe she was 3. I can't remember. She was in a pram. And got stuck on a tube at Stockwell. Gave up, went up the escalators. As I was going through the escalators, the police were jumping over the escalators, herring down the tracks. And of course, that was where suspected suicide bomber was shot, but he turned out not to have been a suicide bomber.
John Charles de Menezes.
Yeah. And, to have been there with my daughter in a pram with all this going on. I mean, it was, I living in London, you're kind of privileged. You're not living in the heart of these awful wars. But that was a kind of unsettling experience. And then I went to Iraq. I went to Sinjar city that had been where the Yazidis, religious minority, had kind of been protected under Saddam Hussein, lived, and they'd been brutally targeted by the Islamic State, who were the kind of inheritor apparatus of both the Ba'athists and of al-Zarqawi, who'd absolutely kind of brutally treated them, crucified lots of men, slaughtered them, enslaved women and girls. Kind of horrible. And to stand there with the Islamic State kind of a couple of miles away across this flat land was a really frightening experience. I felt my nose was brought up close to the kind of horror that, bin Laden had unleashed, but also the American response to it had unleashed. But having said that, of course, I mean, it's what's the alternative? The alternative in which Saddam Hussein is still in power.
Well, this is the thing about history, isn't it? There's no magic wand, and there's no utopian. But I haven't answered your question. I mean, all of this, of course, is local. I think that it's done long-term damage to the moral reputation and the economic stability of the West. Yeah, and yet when you watch
20 years, and I think that it's done terrible damage to the name and the reputation of Islam.
Well, I think that's definitely true. And the extraordinary thing is when you watch that documentary, so it's minute by minute, and you see it, you watch the crisis unfolding through the US administration's eyes. That sense of that looming terrible damage seems a world away, doesn't it? Because they're reacting in such human terms to this appalling tragedy. And they think far more people died than actually did die. I mean, the general sense, wasn't it, on September 11th, was that tens of thousands of people would probably be killed. And even now, that footage, Tom, of the buildings coming down and the smoke rolling through the streets of New York City and the sound of those recordings of the sort of air traffic controllers and so on. I mean, it's heartbreaking, isn't it?
It's heartbreaking, but it's also, as the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard notoriously said,
I wondered if we would get to him.
Exciting.
Yes,
people found it exciting. I mean, it's kind of awful thing to say. Of course, I mean, it was terrible, particularly people in New York or Washington. Of course, I mean, completely terrible. But also, it could not help but evoke images of Independence Day, where aliens destroy Washington, or Godzilla, where a giant monster roams through the concrete canyons and that kind of dust swirling down. I mean, it looked like a Hollywood film. And Baudrillard's point was that, in a way, that was bin Laden's great triumph, was that he had attacked America in the kind of dimension of the imagination.
Yeah, well, but I mean, Baudrillard said basically it's a bit like when that thing about people who watch Formula One races. There's part of them always that's hoping for a massive pile-up. I mean, Baudrillard says, haven't we dreamt of this event? Hasn't the entire world, without exception, dreamt of it? No one could not dream of the destruction of a power that had become hegemonic to such a point. In essence, it was the terrorists who committed the deed, but it is we who wished for it. I mean, I don't think a lot of people were horrified by that at the time, and it was an incredibly controversial essay. But I suppose you could argue Hollywood had created the image of New York being destroyed many times before, bin Laden tried to carry it off.
Although, I guess, again, a kind of counterpoint to that would be that perhaps it actually doesn't show, bin Laden didn't triumph over American control of the imagination. He showed that he was yet another kind of person, enslaved by it. Because, as you said, they were absolutely conditioned by Hollywood films themselves. So perhaps in a way, bin Laden's great spectacle of terror was the greatest tribute that's ever been paid to America's control of the global imagination.
That's a very good note on which to end. And you know what, Tom? We've done this without once mentioning Rudolph Giuliani, which I think is a great achievement on our part, given that of all the stories that came out of 9/11, the rise and fall of Giuliani's reputation is by far the most bizarre and surely worthy of a podcast series in itself. Well, who would have thought then that, with his baseball cap channeling Churchill, and he'd end up outside that garden centre with the dye running down his face defending Donald Trump. Okay, so I have mentioned him now.
You have mentioned him.
Thank you very much for listening, and we will be back next time with more historical meanderings. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Hi everybody, it's Dominic Sandbrook here. There are 2 weeks to go until The Rest is History's inaugural festival at Hampton Court Palace. And frankly, I could not be more excited. There's going to be medieval combat. There are going to be all sorts of big-name historians. You can go to the palace. You can feast like Henry VIII on the very lawns where he walked. In the sunshine, I'll be talking to Tracy Borman about the Tudors. I'll be talking to Katja Hoyer about Weimar Germany. I'll be talking to Ian Hislop about the history of satire. So it's on 2 days. It's on Saturday the 4th of July and Sunday the 5th of July. The bad news is we have actually sold out the allocations that we were given by Hampton Court for both days. The good news, however, we have persuaded Hampton Court to let us have more people. So there will be a handful of extra tickets available for both the Saturday and the Sunday. Now, we do expect all of those extra tickets to sell out really quickly, so please do not wait to get your hands on them. The tickets are exclusive for club members. It's one of the benefits of being a member of the Rest is History Club. Frankly, if you're not a member and you would like to go to the festival, the only way to do that is by joining the club. So you have to head to therestishistory.com to sign up, and then you go to the members area once you've signed up and you select festival to get your tickets. We are really hoping to see as many of you there as possible in the sunshine at Hampton Court. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.